Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez, and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator with the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. And I want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled, What Comes Next? Developing a Transitional Program to Promote Sustained Recovery Success Post-Graduation, featuring our presenter today, Alex Behler. Before we get started with today's content, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions at any time throughout the live session, but we do kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. Additionally, we have the chat enabled for today's session, so feel free to share who you are, where you're joining us from, and as well as any reflections and resources as it relates to today's content. But we do kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature for any specific questions you may have. Additionally, we encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. Additionally, we have a few upcoming events I'd like to share with everybody. Our next water cooler chat will be continuing today's webinar session's conversation, featuring or focusing on transitional programs to promote sustained recovery. Our next free webinar taking place later in March on the 19th will be focusing on high-risk gambling among college students, risk, realities, and responses. This will kind of serve as a precursor for our Learning Collaborative, which we just announced earlier this week. You can learn more about the full agenda by visiting our website. And that Learning Collaborative will be taking place in April, all day on the 16th in a virtual format. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over today to our presenter. Joining us today is Alex Behler, Collegiate Recovery Community Coordinator with Georgia State University. Thank you for joining us, Alex, and it's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I can get this up and running. All right. Does that look good on your end, Anthony?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again. This is such an awesome opportunity. This is actually me realizing an opportunity that I have been dreaming about since about 2019 when I was an undergrad. So this is very surreal for me. But yeah, we're going to be talking about transitional programming to promote sustained recovery post-graduation. Just a quick agenda, just giving you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm just going to go over a little bit more about myself. I do think that's important in terms of my identity structure, as well as the introduction to the topic, the domains of sustained recovery that I identified through my research. We'll talk a little bit more about what transitional programming is and what that may look like, as well as an example of an assessment tool. So jumping right in, my name is Alexandria Behler, but my friends call me Alex, and I hope you do too. I do have a master's in public health and a master's in social work. I also am a certified peer specialist in addictive diseases in the state of Georgia, as well as a certified health education specialist. I am, in fact, the Collegiate Recovery Community Coordinator at Georgia State University. I've been here for nearly a year. I am a published researcher. If you're ever interested in reading my research, I'm happy to share that with you. But arguably, the most important thing that I would like you guys to know is that I am a person in long-term recovery, as well as a graduate of a collegiate recovery community program. And that is important because I used a lot of my experience to kind of build the bones of this presentation, and then used research to kind of bolster it. So talking about my favorite topic of all time, collegiate recovery communities, as well as collegiate recovery programs. I think they're pretty great. And they do quite a few things. That includes helping students build recovery capital, helping them sustain their recovery throughout their academic program, helps reestablish college norms in a way that, doesn't glamorize maladaptive behaviors, brings fun back into the college experience. I know that my most fun when I was a participant in a CRC was game night, but now I would say that book club is my all-time favorite. I know, thrilling Monday evening. Um, it also instills recovery values and helps build community and helps you learn how to leverage those recovery values in both academic and professional settings. It serves as kind of an accountability buddy and encourages, sustained recovery um, through community. And it also provides a sense of stability and routine. I know that my students appreciate the fact that we have our meetings 5:30 to 6:30 every Tuesday, Thursday, except for spring break. That doesn't change. Also, I hope you guys appreciate the cats that I have throughout this entire presentation. I know I need a little bit of comedic relief because sometimes I get really nervous. So I'm just imagining you all giggling. The problem, if you can say, problem with collegiate recovery communities and collegiate recovery programs is that unfortunately they aren't forever. And while we see, wonderful outcomes for students who are in collegiate recovery communities, collegiate recovery programs while they're in school, the question then becomes what happens after they graduate? So let's talk about it. Looking into some of the research that I looked over, the good news is that some postgrads are maintaining their recovery. They have stated that their participation in the collegiate recovery community or program ultimately helped them transition out of the college environment and maintain their recovery successfully. However, the not so great news is that there is a specific demographic this is true for. And in the research that I was looking at, that was predominantly white, heterosexual, cisgender men. While there is not a lot of data for minoritized or multiple minoritized students, what data we do have is saying that they are struggling to sustain their recovery post-graduation more than their white counterparts. So the question then becomes, what is preventing certain demographics from finding sustained recovery post-graduation? And what does that have to do with transitional programming? I promise I'll answer the question. But first, I want to go over the different theories that I used as I was going through the research and the different things that I considered. The first one is third space theory. If you have happened to go to an Association of Recovery and Higher Education conference, you have probably heard me talk about this theory approximately 1,000 times. But as a quick overview, your first space is yourself, right? So it's your identity structure. I'm a queer Black woman. I am a professional in this field. I am a cat mom, a big sister, et cetera, et cetera. You understand the idea, but those are all the things that embody Alex. The second space are the systems and structures that we interact with on a regular basis. And some of those are voluntary, like school and work. Others are mandatory. Unfortunately, I can't stop participating in society. That's just not how that works. And it can become dangerous or restrictive. As a general example, right? If someone identifies as being LGBTQIA and they live in a, rural area in the South, they may not feel safe to come out as being a part of that community. Similarly, if you're on a college campus and, all of your friends are going to parties and engaging in substance use, it may be uncomfortable for you to say, oh, I don't drink or I'm in recovery. So you may just either not go at all or you check your identity at the door. Third space is what I like to think of as the collegiate recovery community. It's a space where you can show up as your full self and grow. It's meant to be liberatory, evolutionary, transformative, um, and ultimately, it's meant to make you feel safe in the entirety of your identity. The multiple minority stress model is a little bit of a shameless plug. I actually created this model. This is my research. Um, and it's a little bit harder to see, but if you look over to the left-hand side of that model, it just focuses on culturally specific stressors. So I focused on queer Black women sexual assault survivors. So on there, that there's sexual violence, there's queer-based trauma, race-based trauma, cultural betrayal trauma, misogynoir. All of those things lead to chronic stress, which lead to poor mental and physical health outcomes. However, as you see at the bottom middle-ish of the model, there are a few things that can prevent that chronic stress from either getting to a significant or severe degree, or preventing it altogether. And that includes social support, social status, and resilience. And then finally, this wouldn't be a presentation about transitional outcomes if we weren't looking with transition theory, which basically just looks at, the different transitions that happen. They can be events or non-events, aka surprise or, planned for, that result in some sort of change. You have the four S's of coping resources, right? So looking at the situation, is it something you can or cannot influence or change? And is this something you planned or didn't plan? Support, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Yourself, having a solid structure within yourself, that again, that resilience. And then strategies, how do you cope with changes? And then finally, that assimilated change, right? So you assimilate your behavior, your perceptions, and your thinking in order to align with the change that's happening. So as we continue to go through that, I hope you join me in using these as kind of a lens to look through. So now we're going to go over the domains of sustained recovery that I identified. And again, a lot of these I actually went through myself. And I know that there are a lot of different organizations and researchers that may have more domains or less domains. These are just the ones that I found the most pressing. And so we'll start with environment, right? The surroundings and conditions that you interact with outside of yourself. So sounds familiar. It sounds like the second space, right? So that could be society, it could be school, it could be work, it could be home, right? Do those places make you feel safe and comfortable? Do they bring you are they toxic? Do they bring you great stress, right? Those are important things to consider, and figuring out how to adjust and maneuver as you transition from one environment to another, aka school to potentially work, a grad program, whatever that may look like. The financial, what if money wasn't an issue? What a beautiful world we'd live in. Uh, and that relates to the system that we use to maintain a certain quality of life. So that includes, balancing our budgets and managing our bills and finding financial balance, which are all things that, college students have to learn, especially if they are transitioning maybe from high school into college, and they're maybe in what some would say a traditional student age, 18 to 24. They're kind of learning how to do these things. But one of the issues that I ran into was that I have a little app that tells me how long I've been sober, but it also calculates how much money I've saved since I stopped drinking alcohol. Um, and it says that I've saved $19,000. I don't have $19,000 in my bank account, right? And so where does that money go? I never learned how to balance those budgets. So offering options like that and opportunities like that in a collegiate environment can be incredibly helpful. So, social support, I think, is pretty obvious. I work in a collegiate recovery community, but that includes community, connection, kinship, found in others based off of a commonality. That could include your recovery support group, your friends, your family, your therapist, spiritual leader, whatever that may look like, right? Those are people you can lean on for support that you feel safe and comfortable going to. The fourth is structure. So those are the constants you find in daily life that provide both stability and comfort. The easiest way to describe that, right, is routine, time management. That also provides structure. Um, but some of these pillars bleed into each other, and social support, making sure you have a stable social support, can help feel like your foundation is strong. Same with environment, right? If you're constantly um, tiptoeing at work because you're not sure what's going to happen, right? That's not a stable environment. That doesn't provide you structure. The fifth is purpose. Something that serves to fuel you both mentally and emotionally. Most often in the collegiate recovery setting, we see service opportunities. My students volunteer constantly to help out with all sorts of different events throughout campus. It could also be guidance, right? Do you have someone that you can talk about kind of existential things or spiritual things that help bring your purpose into focus? It serves as kind of your soul food. And then finally, the one that I saw not necessarily mentioned, but I saw it as a reoccurring theme was identity honoring. So celebrating the many facets of your identities and your whole authentic self. So a third space, perhaps. But that includes diverse programs. That includes representation, which when I was in the CRC, the supervisor at the CRC back then, who is now my mentor in the field, I remember so vividly her telling me that simply by me existing in that space, I was shifting the paradigm of what it meant to be in recovery and what it looked like to be in recovery. And so I take it very seriously that I am representation in these spaces. And then cultural humility as well, which we'll talk about here in this next slide. But cultural humility in the people that are working around you, I think, is incredibly important, and also feeds into that structure as well. So remember earlier when we talked about what prevents students of a certain demographic or certain demographics from finding sustained recovery? Here are a few examples. So we have lack of institutional support as a barrier on campus to um, finding sustained recovery. And that might seem confusing because we're talking about post-graduation, but this is meant to help establish and advance those things so that as they transition out, we're not having to scramble and do this right after graduation. So lack of institutional support absolutely impacts the work that we do in collegiate recovery. Having a recovery hostile campus culture, which unfortunately, most higher academic institutions um, do have a recovery hostile campus, meaning they either don't have formal supports for people in recovery or people living with a substance use disorder or process addiction. But there also tends to be a glamorization of substances generally within the student population. We do have societal stressors as well, which I think, most college students go through. So there's that peer pressure, newfound independence, stigma, stereotypes, et cetera. But in addition, people of multiple demographics, especially vulnerable demographics, are also having to deal with culturally specific stressors. So racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, misogynoir, etc. We could go all day. Um, Lack of communication, both from the people you're seeking services from, um, as well as, different departments in general. Um, and maybe your students aren't communicating their needs, or they are difficult to get a hold of. Um, Lack of transitional procedures, which, hey, that's what we're trying to uh, bridge here, that barrier. We have a lack of trust, lack of rapport, which is, a truly unfortunate. And I think that, these next 2 points actually really kind of make that even harder, right? Is the lack of trauma-informed care and cultural humility, which cultural humility is the understanding that you're never going to understand everything about everybody's culture, right? No one can say that they are an expert in my lived experience. Only I can say that. So, practicing that cultural humility and being willing to sit with a student and ask them questions about how their culture shows up for them. And, when they say this, what do they mean? Can they explain more about what significance that is culturally? Not having a lack of those automatically makes it really difficult to build rapport. And then lack of representation, which, I've seen. I definitely, it took me a very long time to get involved in these recovery settings because I didn't see myself represented. So I didn't feel welcome there. And then I said, insert more here because we know they exist. Um, and so these different barriers translate um, in specific ways, right? So decreased participation in CRC, which means they're getting less support pre and post graduation. And that leads to additional emotional labor to find things out by themselves. And that gets exhausting after a while. And so you either stop trying, um, or, it wears you down. Um, The disruption in routine or loss of stability is a huge one. Again, you go from knowing when your classes are, when the recovery meetings are, everything has a time, a date, everything's set out, to now I have to build my own routine. Um, can be, very jarring. There's also, chronic stress related to everyday life, right? So if you don't have the coping skills um, or mechanisms in place to help you navigate daily life, those become exacerbated when you again go from an environment where you do have um, structure and social support to not having those, right? And so that means you're going to struggle with your finances, your relationships, time management, employment, which leads to an overall struggle with poor health and well-being. It also, shows it translates to a lack of potential coping resources. So the four S's, right? And that means that navigating everyday stressors or surprise stressors are going to hit that much harder because you don't know how to pivot. Then there's the lack of a third space, which increases the feelings of shame, right? You feel like you have to hide certain parts of your identity and you don't know where to go in order to have your full identity honored and accepted. And that in and of itself would greatly impact my recovery, if I'm being honest. And then the limited knowledge of resources on and off campus, again, you're gonna struggle to do extra emotional labor, and you might not know where to look for certain resources on and off campus. So, what do we do about it? I love to be the bearer of good news and not bad news. So, what does transitional programming look like? This is the bad news is that I cannot definitively tell you 100% what transitional programming looks like. I can tell you what it might look like at Georgia State University. I don't know if I can necessarily tell you what it would look like at a school that takes up the entire town, like the University of Georgia in Athens, um, or, again, schools that are in rural areas. And so transitional programming does vary by quite a few different things. That includes the length of the program, the length of not only the student's program, but also the length of the transitional program that you're going to do. So that could include, how long does the program go if your student is a 4-year student versus a 2-year student versus a 5-year student? Um, it also changes based off of the information gathered, right? What exactly are you gathering? Are you gathering demographic information? Are you gathering recovery related information? Are you recovering things related to the domains, et cetera, et cetera? The needs of the students, right? So that's stable versus unstable domains, right? What are their strengths? Where do their strengths lie? And where are there areas for growth? Then there's the availability of the student. Again, some students may be available more often than others, and that might change what your transitional programming looks like for them. Also, on and off campus resources. One of the things that I did when I first got to Georgia State was I created a list of every single on campus resource. And then I went to all those different resources and asked them what community resources they would recommend. And then I created that document, printed it up, and put it in a binder for students. Um, and that way I can be like, hey, there are all these different resources available to you. Let's write those down on your transitional programs and you can check those out. The questions asked, I think, is also really important, right? It's similar to information gathered, but the way you ask a question can change the answer. And then the future plans of the student, which I do also think is really important. I was actually telling a student earlier that, it doesn't matter if I have all the information on Georgia resources if my student plans on getting a PhD in Florida. Um, so you might have to maneuver a little bit. For me, I think the hardest part about creating any type of programming is where do I start? Um, and so I didn't think it would be fair to have this conversation without creating you a place to start. Um, Ta-da! I created an assessment tool. And keep in mind, this assessment tool is not perfect. Even I created it 6 months ago and I didn't edit it on purpose because there were a couple of things where I was like, oh, maybe I should have added that or I should have considered this, which I think is an important conversation to have. Um, and so, as we were mentioning earlier, um, the questions you ask and the information you gather is important. So I started with student information and I went through, name, email, program of study, concentration, things like that. I think that those, questions are important for figuring out, um, if their next steps, make sense with what they're looking at now, or if they are still interested in that topic, or if, you know, that really brings them joy, whatever that may look like. One of the things that I will mention here is I looked at employment status and I have quite a few. I have a couple of students who do not have a job and they are unhoused. I didn't represent them in this originally. And working at an inner city school, it took me some time before I recognized that, I left off some certain things. So the importance also for this assessment tool is that you are constantly updating it and looking at who you have within your community, um, excuse me, and what they may be going through and what um, identities they may hold. Also, I can hear you all scribbling away on your notepads trying to collect all this information. I actually have a way for you to download it as an editable tool later on, which I'm ruining the surprise. I'm just going to pretend you all were very shocked and pleased at the very end when I'm like, ta-da, here you go. So you don't have to write all of this down. I do have all of this um, typed up for you, ready to go. Okay, looking at recovery information, one of the things that I also realized as I was going through that, right, um, is that I would say about 50% of my students don't identify as being in recovery, primarily because, either because they don't want to put a label on it, or they don't know, they're struggling with adapting to college life. So they don't know what exactly the issue is, or the issue, the concern that they may have. And so at this point, right, they're exploring. So if I were to just say, "What's your time in recovery? What are you in recovery from?" And they're like, "I have no idea how to answer that question." So I was also thinking, if you don't identify as being in recovery, you know, why are you participating in the CRC? Like, what brings you here? Um, and having that as a question, so that you can also represent those students and help guide them as they um, are leaning into what we do at the CRC. But I also asked, how do you feel about your recovery path? And would you like assistance exploring new recovery pathways? Mainly because there are so many, and I hear all the time people say, I did, 12 step for X amount of years. And it was great, but now I do smart recovery, and vice versa. So recovery is fluid in that way. So the next section is related to the domains that we talked about earlier. And these are very rudimentary. Honestly, I didn't go too in depth for a reason. It was really just to give a quick example, but the expectation is that you adapt these to your school. And so for environmental, I ask things like, do you have a quiet, stress-free place to study? Do you feel comfortable where you live? Do you feel comfortable in classes on campus? How often do you travel outside of your residence weekly? You can add a million different questions in relation to um, environment. And then for support system, I kept saying I need to make this section bigger, right? Please describe your support system. And the reason I asked that and didn't just put a bunch of check boxes is because um, there are some people who are part of my support system now um, that I didn't have before, right? So I don't think I would necessarily have put my mom on there originally, but I did put almost all of my cohort in grad school. Um, and so I wouldn't have thought, oh, I'm gonna put family and then I'm not gonna put cohort. Um, so that's an open-ended question meant to help them think about the people they could really reach out to, and then asking them what support they provide. I think is also incredibly important. And also, next question, where could you use more support? That's also a good question for how the CRC can support you. Um, it also helps you identify maybe resources that they're in need of. Then there's, do you engage in therapy or counseling? If yes, is it on or off campus? Do you use other campus resources outside of the CRC? That question is more of do you have a recovery group that you go out to? Do you have somewhere, do you participate in student government? Are you part of a RSO, a registered student organization? Um, and being able to talk about those things as what am I thinking? Places of support also helps them identify, again, where their strengths lie, and where they perhaps need additional assistance or guidance. Financial is always hard. I was reading through this and I was like, do I really want to ask that question? Again, just examples. If I'm being honest, I probably wouldn't ask the first question. I would probably ask the second one. How often do you feel yourself stressing about finances as opposed to how do you feel about them? I think they answer the same question more or less. Um, but also figuring out if they're taking out student loans. I know that um, it was pretty confusing coming out of grad school and figuring out where to pay my bills because I was going through FAFSA and then I was going through Advantage and then in order to get uh tuition for or not tuition, student loan forgiveness, you also have to apply here, but also you have to go here. And it was really confusing. And so, potentially having the option to be like, hey, we have people on campus that can help you figure that out and help you establish a routine or some sort of cycle there. Um, and then looking at, what best describes your insurance situation. Um, it says insured through USG, that's the University System of Georgia. Are you privately insured, Medicaid, uninsured, etc.? I included that here as opposed to somewhere else because I know I was also very confused about um, insurance post graduation. Like the University of Georgia took care of all that. I just needed to say, good, let's do that. And then they took it out of my account and I didn't have to worry about it. I didn't have that luxury when I entered into the workforce. And then attending seminars about finance related topics, I would argue they're necessary. But I also do think that if you have a pulse on finance, what students need, finance related things, you can also help kind of curate it or help curate it. Then we have structural, right? How do you feel about your routine? What does your routine look like? How does your routine change when you're not in class, right? Do you sleep more? Does it not change at all? Um, and then describe your post graduation plans, which you can put there. I also put in purpose, which you'll see. Um, the next section was identity honoring, right? Do you identify as one or more minority identities? Do you feel represented in the spaces that you inhabited? Um, are the services that you're using affirming for your identity? And are there spaces outside of the CRC that you feel comfortable being yourself in? Um, and then I put, if yes, please list those spaces because there may be other students who could benefit from those spaces. And also, there is a potential for cross collaboration right there. And then in terms of purpose, you could expand so much more on this. I just went with, again, college level stuff, but does your degree program positively challenge you? Um, I know that one of my degree programs was a lot more challenging, and the other one I kind of coasted through. And so, figuring out where your purpose lies in those two different programs and um, how those contribute to you post graduation and finding opportunities outside of a collegiate environment. And then describing how your degree program makes you feel in 5 words. Do you have plans after graduation? If yes, please describe. Again, that was said in structural, also in purpose. And then engaging in service and volunteer opportunities again, making sure that the values that you have, um, adopted over time, are in alignment with the work that you're doing as well. And the final section is meant for students to identify with you, whether you hand this to them and tell them to check their boxes, or you do it with them. Their strengths, their areas of growth, and their goals should be created by them. And so they will need to go through everything you talked about and identify those strengths and how they can help leverage those areas of growth. And then goals, whether they're short, medium, long term, or they are goals week by week, whatever you end up doing in terms of how often you're meeting. Um, this is the section where the students get that autonomy to kind of figure out and choose um, where they want to go, what works for them, and how they're going to establish security and structure. So, some of the follow-up questions that I had after presenting this the first time was originally, how do we define transition? I know that seems like such a simple question, but then you look at the two following questions and it becomes a little hazier, right? So, what happens when a student is leaving but not graduating? Um, right? I have a student right now who is taking a semester or year off and asked for assistance in identifying resources out in the community. Does that count as a transitional programming? Do I need to create a separate transitional document for this specific student? And then similarly, what happens when the student is transitioning in, right? So let's say a student is coming from a rehabilitation facility, a student is coming from recovery school. A student is coming from, we have 7 campuses at Georgia State University. If they're coming from another campus, Atlanta is the biggest campus. So there's a learning curve, and it's also smack dab in the middle of the city, excuse me. So, what kind of transition does it look like if they're transitioning from another campus and also participating in the CRC? And then the same thing with leaving but not graduating. And then, as always, the public health in me can't help but wonder, what would an assessment or an evaluation look like? How do we know the questions that we're asking are working? And how do we know what questions we should be adding or what we're missing? Um, and, that depends upon all the same things that transitional programming really varies by. And so, as always, I like to close out with a quote, and this one was actually particularly important based off of the topic of today. Um, it's by Dr. Lawrence Bryant. He actually said it at a training I went to on Friday, and he said, "Every challenge you've overcome becomes a source of strength for others." And the reason why that's so important is because I really struggled post graduation with finding my purpose, with finding places where I was represented, with um, financial stability, with structure, all of those domains that I mentioned. I really struggled with those. However, my students don't have to because I have already struggled through that. And so I am using the trials and tribulations that I've gone through um, to help my students so that they can come out even stronger on the other side of graduation. So I probably talked too fast, which is why I have completed this significantly faster than I thought I would. But as I promised, if you use this QR code, it will take you to all of the references I used to build this presentation, including my own um, research paper, the slides, the assessment that is fully editable, and there's an additional resource in there for building transitional programming that is significantly longer. I think it's just a general overview of transitional programming. But that way it's adaptable to any university. And my contact information is there, so please feel free to send me emails as well. The end.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing of your work and, of course, for making all these resources and access to the assessment available to attendees. Now we welcome questions for folks, so please feel free to utilize the Q&A or the chat to ask your questions of the presenter. I can share. We just have a couple of upcoming events that I can share with folks so you're aware of them. And let me get this pulled up. So, we will be continuing today's conversation. We have folks will have now access to the assessment and other resources, so you'll be able to spend some time reviewing them. And so if you have any questions of those documents, please feel free to bring those questions to our upcoming water cooler chat, which will dive further into this conversation in a less formal, in a more meeting format. That will be taking place on March 10th. Our next free webinar will be taking place on March 19th, and we'll be focusing on high-risk gambling among college students. And then that session will serve as a precursor for our Collegiate Gambling Learning Collaborative. Our Learning Collaborative is formatted as a all-day virtual symposium, and that will be taking place on April 16th. And feel free to visit our website to learn more about the full agenda for the Learning Collaborative. And I can go ahead and share a slide as a way to connect with us. I'm just going to hop in and check the chat and the Q&A. I'm not seeing anything right now. Oh, people just singing your praises, Alex. So that's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We can go ahead and conclude today's session. Again, we'll be continuing this conversation next month on March 10th. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, all. Oh, I lied. We did have one question. You feel free to address that, Alex, if you'd like. You're mute. Okay.
Naturally. Thank you for your question, Aisha. The question is, do you have any experience with folks being concerned about anonymity with data collection? Yes, I do. In which case I will either, and it depends on their comfortability, I will either exclude that information, so the demographic information, names and such, or I will ask for their student ID number, which is not easily identifiable outside of a collegiate setting. So I have access to those things, being a staff member, but people outside of the organization do not.
Excellent. Well, thank you for addressing those questions. Again, we hope to see everybody at the water cooler chat taking place next month so we can address further questions. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Alex, for sharing of yourself and your expertise. And I hope everybody has a great evening and a great rest of your week. Take care, all.